And I won't take too much time introducing Jim because he was already introduced this morning. He has been doing yeoman work for the Symposium. He's done it 12 times. And he's become a regular at the Texas State Historical Association meeting. He is a tremendously helpful individual. He will review books. I am the book review editor for the Southwestern Historical Quarterly, and he'll review the books that I know when I need an honest review that tells it like it is, about this period that we're discussing today, that I can go to Jim and he will do what needs to be done. Not a hatchet job. He will do what needs to be done. He also has an interest in a person that I've had an interest in for a very long time, and that's actually the way that he's going to get at the bigger issue about how we remember the Texas Revolution. And so I don't want to take any more of your time. Here's all the way from North Carolina, Jim Crisp.
Thank you, Frank. You'll see these people again, so I won't tell you who they are now. So of course, they're all Juan Seguin in one way or another. I'm going to talk about two icons today, as Raul did to a certain extent this morning. It's the cross we have to bear in the San Jacinto associations that the Alamo out-icons us all the time. We just can't compete in some ways, and so I'm going to use the Alamo and Juan Seguin as twin icons to show how sometimes they're linked and sometimes they're unlinked, and that the two stories are intertwined, but also in ironic ways. To tell you just how world famous the Alamo is, you already know most of this, but this is a brochure cover from a conference that was held in 2011 at the University of Milan in Italy. As you can see, it dealt with early American museums and historic sites. There were more than 24 historians there, mostly Europeans, and yet what do they put on the brochure? 4 pictures of the Alamo. And when you compare the Alamo and Seguin, I've enlarged the Seguin picture here and diminished the Alamo picture because their relative importance in the world of icons is even greater than the discrepancy that I'm showing here by far. Nevertheless, especially in the last 2 decades, Juan Seguin has become very much more well-known and very much more considered a major hero of the Texas Revolution. The Alamo today, I don't have to explain its popularity. I think it's amazing that they have somewhere near 4 million people a year go through. I did a book signing there one time, and 14,000 people came in an ordinary day, and we sold 1 book every 3 minutes. I'd like to go back. The people that Raul said are surprised by how small the Alamo is don't always realize that they're passing through the partially restored ruins of the chapel, only the chapel of this much larger mission of San Antonio de Valero, founded by Spanish Franciscans in 1718. The name comes, we think, from the Spanish soldiers from the Mexican city of Alamo de Parras, who were stationed there in the early 19th century. Of course, the Alamo is famous because of the battle. It never designed as a fortress, it nevertheless achieved lasting fame in the aftermath of that 13-day siege, which resulted in the total annihilation of its defenders early in the morning of March 6, 1836. You've met this man already, the one who's responsible for the siege and the taking of the Alamo. And of course, everyone knows about David Crockett. Far fewer people know in the world at large, and I didn't know until I was in graduate school, that Juan Seguin was one of Crockett's companions inside the besieged Alamo, but this captain of a Tejano cavalry company among the Texas rebels dodged death because he was selected, among others, to attempt an escape through the Mexican lines in order to bring desperately needed reinforcements to San Antonio. No sufficient force was to be found in time for the Alamo defenders, but Seguin did return to honor, if not to save, his fellow rebels. In February 1837, as commandant of the Texan Army garrison at San Antonio, following the ultimately successful revolt against Mexico, Lieutenant Colonel, now promoted, a real promotion, Lieutenant Colonel Juan Seguín delivered, in Spanish, because that was his language, the funeral oration over the ashes of those whom he called valiant heroes, who in his words preferred to die 1,000 times rather than submit themselves to a tyrant's yoke. A symbolic portion of these heroes' remains were reportedly ensconced near the altar of Brear's Cathedral of San Fernando by Seguin, but neither the cathedral nor the Alamo's Chapel, the building now designated the shrine and cradle of Texas liberty, would likely be standing today. If it were not for the action, one might even say the subordination, carried out by Juan Seguin in the previous month of January 1837. Early in 1837, Seguin had received an order for the destruction and forced evacuation of San Antonio by Texan General Felix Huston, a man of no relation either in blood or character to the Texan President Sam Houston, who spelled his name a bit differently, but they pronounced it the same way. Sam Houston had in December named Felix Huston as temporary commander-in-chief of the Texan Army. He was an ambitious and impulsive man, and Felix Huston would on February 7th shoot and severely wound in a so-called duel of honor General Albert Sidney Johnston, who lived but later died at Shiloh, the man whom President Houston had sent to replace Felix. Felix Huston draped his orders to destroy San Antonio in the colors of military strategy and stern national necessity, claiming that the exposed and remote city of Brear could easily be captured and used by the Mexican enemy as a staging area for the new invasion of Texas. War, declared Huston, is not a game for puerile weakness and female commiseration. He's a tough guy. But Houston's stern necessity was not only a matter of geography. San Antonio was a city overwhelmingly Tejano in population. The safety of the country, wrote the general to the president, ought not to be hazarded in the least for a people the greatest part of whom are hostile to us. The general made it clear that if it were up to him, not one person of Mexican descent should be left between the Texan army on the southwestern frontier and the enemy on the Rio Grande. Moreover, he suggested that Juan Seguin was unfit to command Texan troops, as he was the commandant in San Antonio at the time, because, in Felix Huston's words, he cannot speak our language. Seguin disobeyed his orders to destroy San Antonio and turned directly to President Houston for a reprieve for his city and his people. His appeal was promptly granted, and the president reaffirmed not only his confidence in Seguin's honor and chivalry, but also in his command at San Antonio, where the fledgling Republic of Texas would, said President Houston, rely on this Tejano officer's ability, patriotism, and watchfulness. Felix Huston's attitudes revealed a tendency that was on the rise in the months immediately following the revolt against Mexico, especially in the exposed frontier regions of South Texas, a tendency towards indiscriminate revenge against any and all so-called Mexicans, that a tendency that was demonstrated most ruthlessly by the volunteers newly arrived from the United States, most of whom, like General Felix Huston himself, had not even been in Texas during the Revolution of 1835-36. That revolution most certainly did not begin, despite the statements of not-so-bad historians to the contrary, that revolution did not begin as a race war. And thanks largely to the actions of Juan Seguín and Sam Huston, it didn't fully develop into an ethnic conflict. The fighting in Texas began as an extension of a Mexican Civil War, one fought between the centralist military dictatorship of Santa Anna and the local and state governments, mostly in the north of Mexico, which defended their rights under the Mexican federal constitution. One of the first Texan officials to issue a call for the defense of that constitution was none other than Juan Seguín. And when the revolt began in earnest in Texas in October of 1835, he was made a captain of cavalry in the Army of the People by a close friend of the Seguin family, Stephen F. Austin, the most prominent Anglo-American colonist in Texas and the titular leader of the rebel Texan army in the first months of the revolt. The Texans defeated the centralist troops occupying San Antonio in early December, but by March, General Santa Anna had retaken the city and killed all of its defenders in the Alamo. Seguin, unable to prevent that catastrophe, recruited a new company of Tejano horsemen and joined General Sam Huston, by then the commander of all Texan forces, in a campaign which, as you well know, ended in the defeat at San Jacinto and with the capture the next day of General Santa Anna. In 1838, while he still wore the uniform of a Texan lieutenant colonel, Seguin's now famous portrait was painted at President Houston's request by Thomas Jefferson Wright here in this city, the new Texan nation's capital city. The man after whom the city was named presented the painting as a gift to Juan. In that same year, Seguin was elected from Brear County to the Texan Senate, where he ultimately, for 2 years, served as the chairman of the Senate Committee on Military Affairs. No small accomplishment for a so-called Mexican who didn't speak English. He was the military man in charge on the most sensitive part of the border in 37, and by 39 and 40, he was the chairman of the Senate Committee on Military Affairs. At the end of his 3-year Senate term, Seguin was elected mayor of San Antonio, the first Hispanic elected to that office under the Texas Republic and the last Hispanic mayor until the elevation of Henry Cisneros to that post in 1981. It was in Seguin's first term as mayor in 1841 when the first Alamo monument was constructed. It was a 10-foot obelisk made from the stones of the old mission, bearing an explicit comparison of the Texans' sacrifice with those of the ancient Greeks who had bravely faced an overwhelming onslaught. Thermopylae had its messenger of defeat, the Alamo had none. According to the Houston newspapers, this monument was set up for display in this city in the summer of 1843. After a few weeks, the price of admission was dropped to 25 cents because of the hard times that Texas was facing in 1843. But it was in Seguin's second term as mayor in 1842 when things began to go terribly wrong for him and for Texas. I've already got a yellow light there. Is that possible? Would you fix the light, please? I just got my 5-minute warning, and I refuse to obey it. I'm like Seguin. I'm going to be insubordinate. It was in the second term as mayor when things began to go terribly wrong for him and for Texas. Mexico and her armies had been distracted by internal divisions since the disaster at San Jacinto in 1836. By 1842, they were ready to try again to subdue the rebellious Texans, and as you heard from Professor Ramos today, twice in that year, San Antonio was captured and briefly held by the Mexican army. In the spring, by General Rafael Vazquez, and in the fall by the French-born General Adrien Wall. Mayor Seguin, who had many contacts and informants in Mexico, warned both the San Antonio City Council and the national government of Texas of the impending Vasquez expedition, and very little damage resulted from the brief foray into San Antonio. But Vasquez and his men spread the rumor, unquestionably false, that Seguin was in collusion with Mexico. Thereupon, Seguin's political enemies, bolstered by the hordes of Anglo-Texan volunteers and new ones from the United States who swept into San Antonio looking for Mexicans to attack, his enemies and these men found the mayor and his fellow Tejanos in Brear to be tempting targets. If you can't get to Mexico to fight Mexicans, fight the ones next door. Unable to defend his neighbors or even his relatives from the violence of the rabble, Seguin resigned his office in the summer of 1842 and took his family into exile across the Rio Grande. There he was given a stark choice by the Mexican government: death, life in prison, or join the Mexican army in the next assault on Texas. Seguin was deeply torn, but in his own words, the father triumphed over the citizen. And he accompanied General Wool in the second Mexican occupation of San Antonio in September 1842. This time, there was no Mayor Juan Seguin to warn San Antonio of the coming invasion, and the Texans suffered many casualties. Several Anglo-Texans, including the prominent rancher Samuel Maverick, were hauled off to prison in Mexico. But also crossing the Rio Grande with the retreating Mexican army were about 200 Bejareño families fleeing Texas under Juan Seguin's protection. Suddenly, the most visible Tejano hero of the Texas Revolution had become the arch traitor to the Texas Republic. The next 6 years were difficult for Juan Seguin, who spent most of them in the saddle, patrolling the northern frontier for the Mexican army and fighting as a guerrilla against the United States during that country's war with Mexico from 1846 to 1848. Yet Seguin had not burned all of his bridges to Texas. He returned to Texas in 1848. His old mentor and friend, Sam Huston, continued to defend his honor and chivalry and vouched for him when he came back to San Antonio at the war's end. Like their United States Senator, Sam Huston, now in Washington, Seguin's neighbors in San Antonio still trusted Juan Seguin. And by the early 50s, he had been elected and reelected as a Brear County Justice of the Peace. In the middle of that decade, in response to the growth of the anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant Know-Nothing Party in Texas, he joined forces with Samuel Maverick and Jose Antonio Navarro, both of whom had been imprisoned in Mexico during Seguin's service to that country. But the three joined together to organize the Democratic Party among San Antonio's citizens. And Seguin and Navarro, who had been one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence of Texas during the Revolution, both tried to keep alive not only the Anglo-Tejano alliance that had been forged during that conflict, but also the popular memory of that joint effort and of Tejano contributions to Texan liberty. The histories of the Revolution, written in the 1830s and 40s by American and European observers, including Stephen Austin's cousin Mary Austin Holly, Henry Stewart Foote of Mississippi, William Kennedy of England, these historians portrayed the fight against Mexico as one between an advanced Anglo-Saxon civilization and a backward, superstitious people incapable of self-government. The first Texan to take up the historian's pen was Henderson Yoakum, and despite his close friendship with Sam Huston, like his predecessors, he gave no acknowledgement of the positive contributions of Tejanos in his 2-volume History of Texas published in 1855. Moreover, he repeated the old accusation of treason against Seguin. Both Seguin and Navarro pushed back against this one-sided view in the 1850s. Navarro's Apuntes Históricos Interesantes, first published in English in San Antonio newspapers, made him the first native-born historian of Texas. He praised the valor of Tejanos who had risen up in revolt against both Spain and Mexico, and he stiffly corrected any would-be historian whose account of Texan heroism began only with the coming of the North Americans. Seguin's answer to attacks on both his own integrity and the character of the Tejanos came in his personal memoirs, published in San Antonio in 1858. As Juan Seguín was transforming himself into a once again respectable citizen in the decade following the Mexican-American War, the Alamo was being physically transformed. Most of the walls around the central plaza were removed and converted into building materials. The United States Army leased the Alamo's ruined chapel from the Catholic Church for a supply depot and eventually added a roof, which meant adding the hump, and giving the building its familiar bell-shaped top. Even late in life, Juan Seguín could not completely evade his controversial past. Despite being awarded a tardy pension in 1874 for his service during the Revolution, the old cry of treason was raised against him once more in a laudatory biography of José Antonio Navarro, written by an anonymous old Texan, probably, according to David MacDonald, Navarro's friend Narciso Leal, but published in Houston in 1876, as you can see, by the Telegraph Steam Printing House. Again, he repeats the charge of treason. The old Texan contrasted the ever-faithful Navarro with the notorious traitor, Juan Seguín. But actually, in the waning years of the 19th century, both the Battle of the Alamo and the Tejanos of the Revolutionary era were fading from the public memory. The state of Texas purchased the Alamo Chapel in 1883, but even in 1886, the year of the battle's 50th anniversary, as you've seen before, there was no major memorial service at the site, and in that same year, the remains of the Alamo Barracks, or the Convento, passed into the ownership of a grocer, the grocery company Hugo and Schmelzer, which you see here, who used the building to store onions and potatoes. The original Alamo monument from 1841, after touring the cities of the Republic and the state of Texas, was housed in the state capitol in Austin until destroyed by fire in 1881. The legislature in that year authorized a replacement monument to the Alamo heroes to be built on the Capitol grounds. Over 35 feet tall, the new monument was completed in 1891. The year after, Juan Seguín died in Nuevo Laredo, where he and his wife Gertrudis had gone to live with their son in their later years. Not until the organization of the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, or DRT, in the early 1890s did a serious effort to create a shrine from the actual remaining Alamo buildings begin. The campaign was led by two formidable women, ranching heiress Clara Driscoll and Adina de Zavala, the granddaughter of Lorenzo de Zavala, a prominent Mexican Federalist who had joined the Texas rebels and become the first vice president of the Texas Republic. Success came in 1905 when a state law purchasing the Convento and transferring control of the entire Alamo property to the DRT was passed. Driscoll and de Zavala subsequently argued bitterly over the proper interpretation and preservation of the Alamo. Driscoll's approach, which focused attention on the chapel as a symbol of the sacrifice of the heroes of 1836, won out over Adina de Zavala's desire to present the old mission's history as a more thoroughly embedded history in the life of the San Antonio community. The Case of the Missing Mexicans is the title I gave to a talk at Midwestern University in Wichita Falls earlier this year. And it has to do with the fact that the labors of the DRT coincided with national trends of historic preservation and ancestor worship that exalted the Anglo-Saxon heritage of the United States. But even though Texas was part of this, there were deeper issues afoot in Texas. The new prominence of the Alamo in the celebration of the Texas Revolutionary heroes did not bring about a renewal of interest in Seguin or the other Tejanos who had fought for Texas liberty. Just the opposite. At a time when the Jim Crow laws of racial segregation and disfranchisement were being applied to Mexican Americans as well as African Americans in Texas, these heroic Tejanos were being purged from the collective memory of the Texas revolution. Moreover, the Tejanos' presence in the historical pantheon of Texas was not simply forgotten, but made virtually impossible by an increasingly polarized interpretation of the revolution's meaning and origins. The San Antonio artist Robert Jenkins Onderdonk and Henry McArdle produced, as you see here, Onderdonk's Fall of the Alamo in 1903, Dawn at the Alamo in 1906. These iconic works became enormously influential in Texas. Each depicted a Manichaean struggle between the forces of light and dark, between civilization and savagery, in a clear departure from earlier Texan artists' portrayal of Santa Anna and his troops as a classic European-style Napoleonic army. All of you have received now, thank goodness, and thanks to the generosity of Debbie Harwell and the Houston Center for Public History, a copy of last spring's Houston History magazine. In it, I have an article, which I commend to your reading, about a lost painting. This is the unretouched painting here, a painting done on commission in 1901 by the same man at the same time who commissioned the Onderdonk painting, which is in the governor's mansion now. The painting reproduction that you see in your magazine is the first ever color reproduction of the restored version of that painting. And I thank Kyle Stallings, the new owner of the painting, for his permission in reproducing it in the magazine. What's in that article? Very briefly, what I try to do is look at these paintings and the writings of the artists and the man who commissioned the paintings to see what their philosophy of history was. How did they think history worked? I talk a good bit about the French historian Jules Michelet, the historian of the French Revolution, and the concept of romantic dualism that infused the writing of history in Europe and in the United States in the early and mid-19th century. Bancroft, Prescott, and Parkman, the great historians of the United States and of North America and of the conquest of Mexico during this time, endorsed and subsumed this romantic dualism in their writing. What is romantic dualism? It's one force against another, one force that absolutely must triumph completely over another. Good versus evil, old versus new, tyranny versus liberty. Civilization versus savagery. One must vanquish the other. De Shields, the man who commissioned these paintings, admired these men, Prescott, Bancroft, and Parkman, shared the romantic approach. And he was, as a patron of the arts, he especially wanted to have produced for him iconic historical paintings. The two paintings commissioned in 1901 by McArdle and Onderdonk reinforce, in Reinhold Niebuhr's phase, the notion of the children of light versus the children of darkness. This romantic dualism in the writing of history in the 19th century, which lasted deeply into the 20th century in Texas, leaves no room for Catholic, dark-skinned, Spanish-speaking fighters for the Texas Republic. They disappear. And in the movies, too, you began to see what these painters had done in their paintings. Sorry, I'm going backwards. In 1915, the highly popular and blatantly racist film Birth of Texas, or Martyrs of the Alamo, showed the revolt as one of outraged whites rising up against a drunken and lecherous Mexican soldiery. In this racially charged binary logic, dualistic logic of white against brown, there was no place for the Tejano heroes. Mainstream academic in history for the next 6 decades virtually ignored the Tejanos, and as late as the 1980s and 90s, anthropologists Richard Flores and Holly Beachley Brear found the stark binary logic of heroic Anglos versus retrograde Mexicans embedded in every aspect of the symbolism and the semiotics of the Alamo Shrine itself. The Alamo, as both Flores and historian David Montejano have argued, became in the 20th century a powerful negative as well as positive icon, essentially justifying Mexican subordination in Texas to a superior Anglo civilization. Eric Gable, in a review essay published in the American Ethnologist in 1995, branded the Alamo as America's premier white identity shrine. It is true that during the good neighbor period of Franklin Roosevelt's 1930s, there were a couple of gestures of recognition of Juan Seguin's heroism. The eminent University of Texas historian Eugene C. Barker, in a 1935 address to a Tejano audience in South Texas, praised Seguin's early heroism, but he passed over his alleged treason. He passed over his apostasy, his fighting for Mexico against both the Texas Republic and the United States between 1842 and 1848 in silence. Amateur Tejano historian Rubén Rendón Lozano, in his 1936 celebration of Tejano contributions to liberty titled Viva Tejas, completely camouflaged the origins of that apostasy by falsely claiming that Seguin had exiled himself to Mexico to protest against the annexation of the Texas Republic by the United States in 1845. That explanation might work if he had Mr. Peabody's Wayback Machine, but time machines weren't invented then either. Even when the Texan descendants of Seguin brought his remains back to Texas in 1976 for reburial in the town which bears his name, the carved words on his tomb recalled only his service to Texas and left unmentioned what I believe were equally honorable years of fighting for Mexico. However, such adulation of Seguin's Texan patriotism was beginning to fly in the face of the revisionist Chicano historiography that was emerging in the 1970s, best reflected perhaps in Seguin's case by a 1979 film for television directed by Jesus Trevino, celebrating Seguin for his martial defiance toward the racist Anglo-Texans who had betrayed him. Things were changing in the 60s and 70s in the craft of history, and mostly for the better in the long run. New voices and perspectives were emerging. Some silences that had lasted for a very long time were beginning to be broken. In the 1990s, a more mature and even-handed historiography of the Texas Revolution produced a superbly annotated edition of Seguin's 1858 memoirs, edited by the devilishly handsome Jesus Francisco de la Teja. And this scholar's balanced biographical portrait of Seguin was augmented by groundbreaking work and prize-winning new works on the Revolution by Anglo-Texas historians Paul Lack in 1992 and Stephen Hardin in 1994. These scholars recognized in their works the full complexity of the conflict of Texas and sympathetically analyzed the roles of both rebel and Tory Tejanos in the War of 1835-36. Important changes were also taking place at the Alamo Shrine itself in the 1990s, which placed Juan Seguin firmly in the constellation of Texan heroes. A comprehensive illustrated wall of history was added near the chapel of the Alamo, which portrayed the mission in the context of the full sweep of Texas history, and highlighted the contributions of Seguin, Navarro, and other Tejanos to Texan independence. Perhaps even more importantly, symbolically, a Mexican flag was added to those of other nations and states in the Alamo's Hall of Honor, representing the diverse origins of the defenders. In 1997, also reflecting the changes taking place in Texan society and in popular culture, the old film strip used for years at the Alamo to portray that binary story of the struggle of '36, with only one very opaque mention of native Texians, whoever they were, among the defenders. That old film strip was replaced by a professionally produced video for tourists, which gave full recognition to the Tejano defenders. In the Alamo Chapel itself, the reenactment of the Spanish oration given by Seguin at the valiant hero's 1837 reburial became a regular feature of an annual remembrance ceremony carried out by the Alamo Defenders Descendants Association, founded in 1994 by both Anglo and Tejano families. A gentleman here today, raise your hand, Albert. Albert Seguin. If you look very closely, Albert Seguin can be seen in that picture. Let's blow it up. There you are, Albert, wearing the same shirt in the group picture that you did in the individual one. That's how I found you. Albert Seguin has been even more active in the Seguin Family Historical Society. Thanks in large part to the efforts of Albert and other Seguin descendants, the 21st century has seen an explosion of Seguin commemorations and recognitions. An equestrian statue showing Seguin as a Texan warrior was mounted on his tomb in Seguin, Texas in October of 2000. By the way, the reason the town was named after Seguin was because when he was their senator, he got him a post office. That's true heroism. In the new Bullock Museum of Texas History, opened in Austin in 2001, the military history of the Revolution is narrated by the voice of Juan Seguin. In September 2001, the main road leading to the San Jacinto Monument was renamed Juan Seguin Boulevard by the Texas Division of Parks and Wildlife. And this painting, available to the public on postcards at San Jacinto, shows Seguin's role in San Jacinto as it became recognized in popular history as well as academic history. And as in all popular history, his heroism is sometimes the subject of slight exaggeration. Seguin and his men were not on horseback at the Battle of San Jacinto. In 2002, a high school and 2 elementary schools named for Seguin were dedicated in the distinctly non-Tejano towns of Arlington, Weatherford, and to some extent Huston. That same year, an expanded second edition of Seguin's Memoirs and Correspondence, edited by the still handsome Frank Delateo, was published by the Texas State Historical Association. And finally, the movie. As if to put Hollywood's imprimatur on the new and improved version of the Alamo story, the Disney Studios' 2004 Alamo featured the Spanish actor Jordi Moya as an intense and vigorous Juan Seguin, giving sage advice to both Billy Bob Thornton's Davy Crockett and Dennis Quaid's Sam Houston. The movie was a monumental commercial flop. I think the second most unsuccessful movie financially in American history. But it nevertheless served to put an exclamation point on the scholarly and popular rebirth of Juan Seguin as an Alamo and Texan icon. The movie's final scene shows Jordi Moya's Seguin making the somber return to San Antonio to bury the ashes of his friends, no doubt helping to secure his reclaimed place in the pantheon of Alamo heroes. But to show only the heroic Juan Seguin, to ignore the part of Seguin's life during which he was forced to defend his family and other Mexican Texans against unfair attacks, and even take up arms against the Texas Republic and the United States, is to leave off an important account of his life, as do both the Alamo movie and the inscription on his tomb. It's not to deal fairly with either Seguin or the history of Texas. When we tell the story of the Tejanos, of the Revolutionary and Republic periods of Texas, the only way that we can know the full history of this era is to deal with the Tejanos as whole men and women. Because only in telling their full stories can we appreciate the full story of Texas, including the less comfortable aspects of our common history. What does it say about the Texas Republic that not only Seguin, but even a revered and steady Texas patriot like Jose Antonio Navarro felt more secure under the flag of the United States after 1846 than they had felt under the flag of the Texas Republic? Unfortunately, this flag, especially for Tejanos and the residents of South Texas and the long valley of the Rio Grande, came to stand for more pernicious principles than liberty alone. So let me close with a paragraph that I wrote in the year of the Texas sesquicentennial in 1986, a paragraph that still represents my feeling about the Texas past and how we as historians have an obligation to deal with it. In a chapter in a book called The Texas Military Experience, in which I trot out my revisionist thesis that race and racism were not the prime causes of the Texas Revolution, but came mostly later, I added this. As we rewrite the history of the Texas Revolution, let us follow the logic of our revisionism past San Jacinto. During and after the sesquicentennial decade, there will be a horde of taxidermists at work on the Texas Republic, doing their best to portray that quaint and colorful nation in the most flattering of poses. But let us hope that the Republic will also become the object of study of a few skilled historical pathologists who should strive not merely to identify and curse the crippling infection of racism, but also to understand the conditions that favored its growth. Perhaps in so doing, they will derive some lessons for the living from their examination of the dead. These historians may shed some light on what could be the ultimate irony of the sesquicentennial, our belated recognition that the greatest measure of oppression in Texas came not before 1836, but after. Thank you.
Okay, well, if there are any other questions that have come up, please bring them over to Jim Crisp. In the meantime, I'm going to start with the questions that I received, and what I've done is I put them in the order in which the presenters came up to the podium. And so the first one is for Jeff Dunn. And he didn't think he was going to have to do this, but he was a presenter. So he's on here. The 8 Texans killed at San Jacinto, and buried in the trench were the bodies relocated, reburied, or are they still in the trench? If they're left in the trench, has the trench been found?
As far as we know, they are still there. And there has been no archaeological work done on that site. There's been talk about doing archaeological work there, but it's never been done. But the Brigham Monument, when the Brigham Monument was erected in 1882 on that site, the only evidence of the graves was a tombstone for B.R. Brigham, who was one of the 8 killed in the battle. His tombstone was the only one standing at that time, and so that's why they put the monument there, and that's why they call it the Brigham Monument, even though it commemorates all 8. Now, actually, there was a 9th who was killed, Owen Trask, who was wounded at the cavalry skirmish the night before, and the story is that he was actually brought to Galveston Island and died there. So if you look at the monument, there really is a commemoration for 9 Texan soldiers, because they include him as one of them, although he was not actually buried there at the battlefield.
Thank you, Jeff. And by the way, sometimes the more than one name was checked off, and sometimes it said no one in particular, so I have taken the liberty of deciding who's going to answer the question. It's a wonderful prerogative to have. By the way, my wife thinks that I look like Paul Newman. And it's okay for her. She has to live with me. Where Jim thinks that I'm devilishly handsome, I will take it back to her, but I have no idea. But anyway, so this one's for Francis, and it's, yeah. This one's for Francis, and it says, what is the biological predominant DNA background when one is referring to the Tejanos in the early and mid-19th century? European, indigenous, so what are they?
Wow, that's a good question. Well, in 18th century, for the settlers at Los Adayas, the majority of those were coming from Monclova, Monclova, from Saltillo, and other places to the south. And so that the majority of them were really from humble backgrounds. Often, many of them were illiterate. When the documents, in looking at the documents and government records, investigations, a lot of times they could not even, they did not sign their own name, and so somebody signed for them. And this had implications, but so they were of humble background, and so it's interesting that 1731 is the really the first time that you kind of get a glimpse of this kind of caste designations that had emerged as a result of this mestizaje, or cultural mixing, in colonial Mexico. And in that military roster for Los Adayas of 1731, they mention probably about just less than half that are listed as Español, or Spanish, and about half, or just a little bit more, as being of mestizo or mulatto description. And so the thing with that is that at Los Adayas, there wasn't an actual census record made. And so then when I was putting together my list from census records from the 1780s and 1790s and all the way up until 1809, you have then various caste designations. And somebody would go from being a mulatto one census, and then the next one be Español. So there's this element of whitening process that historians have talked about. David Weber, and I believe De la Teja mentions as well in San Antonio de Béjar. And, but there were really very few that were directly from Spain, if I'm not correct, right?
Yeah. Thank you. And I'll remind the presenters, we have quite a few questions, so if they could keep their answers as brief as possible. And so, Craig, it's all your. Don't aim it this way. Don't aim it that way. Yeah, there you go. Don't aim the microphone back at the speaker. Craig, it's all yours. Why do you call the Goliad execution a massacre?
I did say so-called. So-called. Wow.
Keep it short.
I will. Number one, partly when I was raised, this is how it was referred to, and growing up there, that's how I learned it. And it's hard to unlearn something that goes back to, so far. But that's the short answer. Is it a massacre? Oh my gosh. How about this? It is propaganda. But that does not take away from the sadness and tragedy of it. And one of my last comment here, one of the saddest things I ever ran across was, hey, the soldiers that had to carry this out, I can't imagine. I can't imagine. It haunted them.
Thank you, Craig. Okay, so the next question is for me, and it's a real fast answer. It's, what about the false leg of Santa Anna? Well, Santa Anna at San Jacinto was still two-legged. He did not lose the leg until, 3 years later, when it was blown off in the process of defending Mexico from the first French invasion in something called the Pastry War, when a French warship with a small invasion force showed up to collect the debt. And Santa Anna decided he could reclaim his popularity by becoming the hero of the nation. So he rushed out at the head of the army. The French, they were all sick as dogs, but they managed to lob a few cannonballs at him. And one of them hit his leg, and it came off. And then, of course, because he was a true patriot, he had the leg ceremonially buried in a cenotaph in Mexico City. A few years later. So anyway, it's a very strong, but at San Jacinto, he still had both legs. Next question is for Omar. And it says, Omar points, don't aim the microphone at them. Omar points out border residents or military problems. If it is true that Santa Anna conscripted troops from northern Mexico, were they also taking citizens as troops?
Oh, sure, yeah. I mean, they were conscripting wherever they could find.
Microphone close to the...
Oh, sure. So the military was trying to get as many able-bodied men as they could, and so they were trying to they took whoever they wanted, they could. That's why people were hiding. There was many reports of people basically just trying to hide from the census takers, because they knew that if the census takers, wrote down how many people actually lived in the city or in these cities, in these towns, that they were likely going to be conscripted. And Matamoros, the alcalde in Matamoros would actually sometimes write to military officials and say, many of the people who live in this town are merchants, or they're elderly, or they're children, so we shouldn't have to contribute as many. So, but yeah, they were definitely conscripted.
Okay, thank you. And the next one is for Jim. Stop arranging your papers. Okay, and did Juan Seguin and members of his command receive bounty and donation land grants for their military service?
That was one that was addressed to you as well.
It was, but you got it, because I just talked.
Well, you probably know more about that than I do, so I'm going to punt.
You're going to punt. Okay, yes, they did. Actually, at the General Land Office, there's extensive documentation, and quite a few people got both bounty and donations. Juan Seguin. They mostly sold them right away, so they never did locate the certificates, but they did receive certificates for service. Later on, they also received, some of them, received pensions when they could be proved up, and actually Juan Seguin, Antonio Menchaca, both served as witnesses on a number of claims, not just by Tejanos for military service, but also for some of the Anglo-Texans. So they did receive compensation, and the families of a couple of the fallen at the Alamo also received their donation certificates. So there is documentation that there was compensation.
Let me just add to that remember that everyone who was living in the Texas Republic at the time of the Revolution got a first-class headright.
They got, right, there was all kinds of lands being given to all kinds of people, but one way, of course, the Army didn't, the Republic didn't have a way to pay the Army during the Revolution, so they paid them in bounty land, and for every 3 months of service, you got 360 acres, up to a maximum of 1,280. And then on top of that, if you participated in one of the major battles, or the survivors of the Alamo were also entitled to an additional donation. So there was a significant amount of land that, if you managed to retain it all, would make you land wealthy. But of course, most people couldn't afford to keep it, and land speculators swooped in and bought a lot of these certificates, and for pennies on the acre, if you will. And so there's a lot of land that passed out of the hands of the recipients.
Every Tejano in Texas whose loyalty was not questioned got a first-class headright.
Yep.
But there's a lot of good scholarship on the market of these things, and how many of them were sold. As Frank says, pennies on the dollar in many cases. Seguin bought some of those himself.
Yep, he was in on it. Okay, so the next one's for Jeff again, and we're coming back around. Was Sam Houston trying to retreat far enough east to bring the U.S. into the war, and is there any evidence U.S. government was building up forces to enter Texas and take part in the battle?
Well, that is a very interesting question. It's been asked numerous times. It's one of the more speculative aspects of the whole revolution as to what was Sam Houston really thinking as he was moving east? Was he really trying to hook up with the United States government? One theory was that he was going to try to argue that the Neches River was the boundary, the real boundary. If he could lure Santa Anna across it, maybe he could entice the United States to intervene. We don't really know, and it's all speculative. There are some documentation to the effect that maybe Andrew Jackson had sent Houston to Texas some years earlier. General Gaines had a force in Louisiana, but he pretty much maintained neutrality. There was an effort to try to contact him, but by and large, I mean, my personal opinion is that I don't think that the United States had plans to intervene, and largely probably would not have intervened at this point because they were viewing this as a civil war, even though Texas was trying to become independent. And it was really against the law of the United States for Americans to even come to Texas to participate in a revolt in Mexico. So my personal opinion is that was not the case.
Thank you, Jeff.
And so, of course, no Americans came to Texas during the Revolution to help because it was illegal. I think I have to disagree with Jeff. One way that it would have been legal for the United States to have intervened was in hot pursuit of hostile Indians. And one of the things that Sam Houston was doing all through February and into March was writing letters about the incipient Indian revolts and Indian attacks that were going to take place. He was generating this background. And one last point. Who was the chief American secret agent in Texas before the Revolution? Sam Houston. Sam Houston was definitely sent to Texas by Andrew Jackson. And when he had looked at Texas, he crossed back over to Natchitoches, Louisiana, and wrote a letter, which is in the Jackson papers, which says, okay, I'm going to go live in Texas, and I'm going to do everything I can for the success of your plan of making Texas part of the United States. That's in the Jackson papers.
Okay, so we can see that we have a debate, and this is one of those, it's like, how did Davy die? All right, it's just not, you can't drive a stake through its heart. It's just going to persist forever. Was there a conspiracy to bring the United States on board? It's one of those things that there's plenty of circumstantial evidence on both sides, but there's no hard facts. And Jeff's a lawyer, so he knows about circumstantial evidence. Anyway, so Francis is up next. Do you know if there were any individuals of Hispanic descent from East Texas who were slaveholders, similar to William Goyen, the African-American who held slaves?
Short answer, yes. As a matter of fact, in 1778, during the American Revolution, 1 year before Spain joined on the side of the Patriots against England, because of the alliance that Spain had with France, Antonio de Ibarbo was trading cattle for slaves in Louisiana, and he had done that on a couple of occasions. And it had been illegal for many of the settlers to trade in cattle,
to trade in tobacco, and so then it wasn't until the following year then that that trade in cattle was made legal. And so there's actually some slave sales, about 32 of them that occurred during the Spanish era. Some of them as early as 1748 in Los Adayas, and later on in Nacogdoches. And so there are a number of individuals that are Tejano that are involved there. And so, and basically then those slaves were more domestic servants, if you will, because Texas did not have the slavery like it did in Veracruz, which was more a plantation slavery. And so that's...
Thank you, Francis. Okay, Craig, so you're up again. And this one's really straightforward. It says, restate your closing statement about forgiveness.
Well, that's going to go close to my heart. Anytime that people deal with such trauma in life, it is one thing to remember bravery, courage, dilemmas, divisiveness. And what I was trying to say at the end was, how do we get past what may be very negative feelings towards people that did us wrong? Whether it is somebody that did something wrong to us in our own life now, or historically speaking. And to forgive, which was my little message there, is not to forget or to say it was all right, but it's how you move on. And you have to embrace, golly, that we just all have faults. And historically speaking, that's very dear to my heart, and that's really what that's about.
Thank you. So the next question is for me again, and this one's a rather complicated one, so bear with me. Being a direct descendant of James Powers and 2 ranches are Mexican land grants, what are the legal rights to the blood heirs if sold or someone is trying to sell them when they should be handed down to the next in line? And so the answer is that when property is sold, it no longer belongs to the individual who previously owned it. So when land is granted to someone and then passes out of their hands, it belongs to whoever either A, inherits it, or B, buys it. So their blood, just because you're the blood heir of an individual doesn't mean that you have rights to property that that ancestor may have owned generations before. If the land, even in the case that the land may have been stolen in the far past, there are laws again called adverse possession laws, which actually protect innocent holders down the road. So it becomes a very legal thorny issue that often has to be worked out in the courts. And sometimes, if there's proof of enough shenanigans over enough period of time and you go to court, you can actually win a case. That was actually the case of the Bailly family with what is known as Padre Island. Did they get the land back? No, but they were able to get compensation because it was proved that part of the land was stolen. So it actually depends on what happened originally, but if there's a legitimate sale of property intervening, then there are no more rights. It has to be proven that, and substantially proven, that something went amiss in the transfer of the property. So the next one is for Omar, and you talk about, let's see, talk about westward expansion. Why? And I'm asking Omar because this was originally directed at Raul, and Raul's not here. You talk about as westward expansion. Why was there no Mexican northward expansion, or was there?
Oh, sure. There was. Of course, there was Mexican northward expansion. That's why the people that I speak about in the Villas del Norte come from south of, the border, today's border. They come from Nuevo León and Coahuila. So one of the things that actually I speak about in my book is how these changing jurisdictions occur partly because of, Spain is holding on to these or claiming this land, and then Mexico wins its independence. Mexico, has jurisdiction over this land, and then Texas claims the land but never really has jurisdiction over the villas, at least, and then the U.S. takes over. So, I find it really interesting to see what happens as a result of these changing jurisdictions, both in terms of ethnic relations, so my book deals with that, gender relations. I look at how, in many ways, women took advantage of sort of U.S. laws over divorce, over property, and over sort of civil disputes and marriage, and also what happens in terms of their citizenship. They go from being Spanish subjects to being Mexican citizens to eventually some of them becoming American citizens. So, but definitely there's northern expansion. It's just not as successful because no one wanted to live far away from central, or very few people wanted to live far away from central capitals. You know, today I tell my students, I'll end with this, I tell my students that, you know, many of us are sort of so used to sort of modern conveniences like a coffee house, a Starbucks or whatever, that if you end up going somewhere in the US where there isn't such a thing, you don't like it. You don't want to be there very long. Most of us, not all of us. And it's the same thing in the, you know, in the colonial period. They didn't want to be, they wanted to have manufactured items. And you know, they didn't want to be in California or New Mexico or Texas if they could avoid it.
And I'll just add that all you have to do is look at Texas today and look at the map of Texas and think about the difference in the population east of the I-35 corridor and west of the I-35 corridor. Where do Texans live? All right, so it's that way everywhere. Nevada is a good example as well. Once you go outside of Reno and Las Vegas, where do people live in Nevada? Practically nowhere. Okay, so we're back. Don't aim at the speakers. So this is coming to Jim. So there.
Before that, let me return the favor. This is one that just came in. It was addressed to you, but I'll return the favor and try to answer it. History teaches us that the U.S. acquired land. How do you acquire land from Mexico? Well, the answer is by treaty. 2 treaties. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, after Mexico was defeated in the War of 1846-48, and the Gadsden Purchase Treaty of 1853. And if both countries ratify it, then might is righted by treaty after a war. That's how the land was acquired by the United States.
Yep. Okay, and so Bowie, Travis, and Fannin were active in smuggling slaves. The Grosses and Whartons were the largest slave owners and wealthiest Texans. How reasonable to suppose that the Alamo and Goliad were actions to, I think it's distract, so as to give Gross time to get slaves and cotton out?
No.
Short.
The Texans, Tejanos and Anglos, for the most part, saw their developmental future in cotton, and whether they liked slavery or not, saw slavery as part of that developmental future. You don't have to have slaves to raise cotton. You do have to have slaves to get rich doing it. Same thing with tobacco. The reason that slavery came to North America and other places in the Americas is because 90% of the Indians died, and the people who owned the land didn't want to work. And so in order to make a lot of money from vast land holdings, you had to force someone to work for you. That was the cruel irony. That's the bitter paradox, as David Potter said, about American history, that there was so much opportunity for so many people to get so much land that if you owned a lot of it, you had to make somebody work for you in most cases.
I wrote the question, that wasn't what I asked. And what I was asking is the tie between the three.
Goliad and the Alamo were not distractions. Look, the best book, and I'm not going to try to give the full answer, but the best book on the role of slavery in the Texas Revolution is Mike Campbell's Empire for Slavery. It would seem logical that slavery was a big cause of the revolution, and Campbell makes a very persuasive argument that it was not. Let me give the analogy of the American Revolution. Had the American colonies not been successful in their revolution against Britain, slavery would have come to an end more quickly in our part of North America. But the revolution wasn't fought about slavery. Any more than the Texas Revolution was fought only about slavery. But there was a very close connection between the desire for land speculation and economic development, and that meant cotton and slavery in that economy. And as Ed Miller said in a book that was previously referred to, and I would commend it to your reading, New Orleans and the Texas Revolution, the New Orleans merchants had a greater impact on what happened in the Texas Revolution than the people of Texas. That's a simple fact. They were the ones pulling a lot of the strings. But that doesn't mean it was just for slavery, nor were most of the people fighting consciously for slavery. But William Barrett Travis wanted to come to Texas and become a one-generation aristocrat like Andrew Jackson had done in Tennessee. And what allowed them to do that was slavery. So it's a complex subject, but it's not a simple one-to-one correlation.
Okay, so, and I'll just add that it's another one of those debatable points. I don't agree with Mike Campbell on it. I won't take up time here. But I don't think that you can separate the battles from the causation. I think you see enough of the propaganda regarding protection of slave rights. Once the Constitution is issued, and you can see it in the Constitution, a restoration of the status to slavery of those people who had been made indentured servants and freed under Mexican law previously. So slavery is part and parcel, but does it affect the fighting? And I wouldn't go that far. So I wouldn't see what happens at the Alamo as a diversionary or a distraction in order to allow anybody, the wardens, but anyway, that's another story. Let's move on. Craig Roll, what was the legal status of Anglo colonists in Texas? Did you have to become a Mexican citizen to obtain a head right?
The simple answer is yes. You were not only supposed to become a Mexican citizen, but you were supposed to become Catholic. However, that was not enforced, even perhaps not enforceable. So I kind of do this with my students. I say a lot of times when they did this, they went like this, King's X, yes, I'm a loyal Mexican citizen, and yes, I'm Catholic, when they were maybe Baptist. Does that answer the question? Yes.
It's important to realize that the man who baptized Sam Houston into the Catholic faith so that he could own the land was Jewish.
Adolphus Stern.
Adolphus Stern of Nacogdoches, who was married to a very devout Catholic woman.
Yeah. Okay, so we do have to wrap up the question-answer period, so I am going to very quickly go through a couple of questions that were either directed at me or at nobody in particular. The first one is, why do you think the second round of the Texas Revolution, the Alamo, Goliad, San Jacinto, eclipses the first round, Alazan, Rosillo, and Medina? The answer is that we don't have, and of course, part of the first round is actually the siege of Brear, which ends in early December with the capture of the city and the forced withdrawal of Martín Perfecto Cos's army, which, of course, is supposedly a motivation for Santa Anna to come to Texas because, again, supposedly, Cos is his brother-in-law, but Cos is not his brother-in-law. But in any case, the bottom line is that the first part eclipses the second, except for, of course, Gonzales, because they're small. They're rather small events that don't produce the kind of visceral reaction that the big events of the spring do. Because after all, in the fall, you've got these small forces and small Mexican armies involved, and it's the colonists, whereas in the spring, my God, you have Santa Anna coming to Texas to put down this revolt, and so you've got the Alamo, and then you have this event at Goliad, and I'm not going to fall into the execution massacre thing, so I'm just going to call it the event, in which over 300 of the captured Texians are executed following their surrender, following a botched battle. And you also then have San Jacinto, where the situation's reversed and the mass slaughtering is of the Mexican soldiers. So those are big events, and they're played out by larger-than-life characters on both sides, and therefore that's why they've gotten the attention. But if you take a look at Steve Hardin's book, he's very balanced in his approach to the story, and he narrates the development of events, giving full attention to other minor episodes like Agua Dulce in South Texas. So I would say that popular culture, once again, wants to pay attention to the big things and ignores all the little details that are often just as important as the big events. Another question that I got, and I don't know why I got this one, but who was Vicente Travieso? And Vicente Travieso was one of the original Canary Island settlers, and he happened to be one of the more successful ones in town. In fact, one of his sons went off to Saltillo, set himself up with homes. He had a home in Saltillo and in San Antonio, and he was reported in the censuses of both places. And in San Antonio, he's reported as an hacendado. I mean, he owns a lot of property. In Saltillo, he's reported as a merchant. So that's who Vicente Travieso was. And his descendants are still running around Texas making trouble, just like he did. He had a very appropriate last name, Travieso, which in Spanish means that you get into trouble, sort of mischievous. Okay? To be travieso is to be mischievous. All right, and then the last question, and this is the humdinger of them all, and I would suggest that you read Paul Lack's The Texas Revolutionary Experience, because he spends an entire chapter discussing the whole issue of what is a revolution, and that is, was the War of 1836 a true revolution? And again, that's something that scholars argue about what the nature of revolution is. Some argue that the revolution is the culmination of events, and some argue that a revolution starts a chain of events. If you look from the first perspective, you see the war as the culmination of changes that had been taking place in Texas over the previous decade to decade and a half, and the revolution, in fact, enforces those changes that the people in the area want. And so revolution is culmination of a process. If you want to look at the revolution as the start of something different, it's a little bit more difficult to make a case, because once Texas becomes independent, its constitution mimics the constitution of other American states. The form of government very quickly the legal system adopts the English common law, except for a few unique aspects of the Mexican law that the Texans like, so they keep. But one can make the argument that the Texas Revolution is revolutionary not just in Texas, but it sets off the changes that will bring about the modern United States into being. Because without the Texas Revolution, you don't have the Mexican War. Without the Mexican War, you don't have the cession, the Mexican cession. So the United States doesn't acquire the western part of the country. So I'll leave it there because it is a complicated question. Thank you very much, and we have.